My life had become a predictable waltz, a sequence of steps repeated with robotic precision. Mornings began with coffee brewed in silence, the radio humming softly in the background, followed by hours spent managing spreadsheets in my home office. Evenings were equally uneventful. A solitary walk through the park, dinner for one, and a book before bed. At 54, I had mastered the art of solitude, though not by choice. My daughter lived across the country with her growing family, and the divorce that had fractured my life a decade ago seemed like a faint but relentless echo. The grocery store was my one constant venture into the world. It was hardly exciting, alls of canned goods and fluorescent lighting, but it provided a fleeting connection to life beyond my walls. That's where I first saw him. I was reaching for a jar of pasta sauce, trying to balance my purse and shopping list, when a deep voice startled me. "Here, let me help." I looked up, and there he was, a young man, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, with warm brown eyes and a shy smile. He handed me the jar, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring at him like a fool. "Thank you," I finally managed, feeling my cheeks flush. "No problem. I'm Matt," he said, offering his hand. His handshake was firm, his touch oddly grounding. "Elaine," I replied, suddenly self-conscious. What followed was a conversation as brief as it was inconsequential. A comment about the rising price of groceries, a chuckle about the weather. But when he walked away, a strange warmth lingered. It wasn't just his kindness or his handsome features. It was the way he'd looked at me, as though I wasn't invisible. For the first time in years, I noticed the days after meeting Matt felt subtly different, as though some invisible current had shifted in my routine. I returned to the grocery store that same week, not needing much but eager for another glimpse of him. I chastised myself for the silliness of it. "What are you expecting, Elaine? A rom-com moment in aisle 5? But there he was, standing near the produce section, carefully inspecting apples. "Back for more pasta sauce," he teased, his easy smile making my heart flutter unexpectedly. I laughed, feeling a rare lightness in my chest. "Not this time. Just grabbing a few things." We spoke longer that day, a casual conversation stretching into something deeper. He told me he was a teacher, working at a local high school, and I shared snippets of my quiet life, my freelance work, my love for gardening. There was no pretense, no awkwardness, just an effortless connection that left me smiling long after I'd walked away. Over the following weeks, our encounters became more frequent. At first, it seemed coincidental, bumping into him while I browsed the dairy aisle or lingered near the bakery. But soon, it was clear we both lingered longer than necessary, our conversations growing more personal. He told me about his passion for music, how he played guitar in a small local band. I spoke of my daughter, my love for classical novels, and even touched on the loneliness that sometimes crept into my days. "It's funny," Matt said one evening as we stood by the checkout lanes. "I never thought I'd enjoy talking to someone about gardening and Jane Austen. But here we are." I rolled my eyes playfully. "Are you saying I'm boring?" "Not even close," he replied, his voice softening. His gaze lingered a second too long, and I felt a strange, unspoken charge between us, a fleeting spark that left me both exhilarated and unnerved soon. It wasn't just the grocery store. Matt began suggesting we grab a coffee after our chats, and one day he invited me to watch his band perform at a small cafe downtown. I hesitated, feeling self-conscious about stepping into his world, but his enthusiasm was infectious. That night, sitting in the dimly lit cafe surrounded by strangers half my age, I watched Matt transform on stage. His usual easy charm gave way to an intensity as he played, his fingers moving deftly over the guitar strings. His voice, strong, soulful, filled the room, captivating everyone, but none more than me. Afterward, he joined me at the table, his face glowing with the thrill of performing. "So, what did you think?" he asked, leaning in slightly, his expression eager. "You were incredible," I admitted, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. He grinned, the kind of smile that could light up an entire room. "Coming from you, that means a lot." Our coffee outings became regular, our conversations delving deeper. We talked about everything. His dreams of recording an album, my regrets about putting aside my own creative pursuits for practicality. He encouraged me in ways I hadn't expected, suggesting I pick up my old sketchbooks or try writing again. "You've got so much to share," he said one afternoon, his sincerity catching me off guard. Don't let anyone, not even yourself, tell you otherwise. His words stayed with me long after I'd returned home, sparking something dormant inside me. With Matt, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, as though he'd opened a door to a part of myself I'd long since locked away. But with that newfound vitality came an undercurrent of confusion. Every time he smiled at me, every time his hand brushed mine as he passed a coffee cup, I felt a stirring I couldn't ignore. It was more than admiration or friendship. It was something deeper, something I was afraid to name. The realization hit me like a quiet storm, gentle at first, then impossible to ignore. It began one evening as I sat on my porch, sipping tea, and replaying the day in my mind. I'd met Matt for coffee again, and we had laughed so hard over some silly anecdote from his students that my cheeks ached. The way he leaned in while talking, the warmth in his voice, and the way he looked at me as though I was the only person in the room, it all lingered with me, tugging at my thoughts long after he'd gone. At first I dismissed it. He's just kind. He's attentive. But the flutter in my stomach whenever he smiled, the way my heart leapt at the thought of seeing him again, those weren't feelings I could brush aside. Sitting there, staring into the twilight, I finally admitted it to myself. I was falling for him. The admission filled me with equal parts exhilaration and dread. How absurd was it really? A woman in her 50s, divorced, with grown children, harboring feelings for a man who couldn't be more than 30? I laughed bitterly to myself, the sound hollow. But then, the laughter faded, replaced by an ache I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just about the age difference, or the fear of judgment. It was the vulnerability of allowing myself to feel something so raw and uncharted. After years of living quietly, safely, I was terrified of the risks that came with opening my heart again. I thought back to my marriage, to the years of quiet discontent that had followed its initial spark. My ex-husband, while a decent man, had grown distant as the years went by. Love had turned into routine, routine into monotony. By the time we divorced, we were strangers sharing a house, our connection severed long before the paperwork made it official. Matt was different. He made me feel seen, truly seen, in a way I hadn't in decades. He listened with a genuine interest that was almost unnerving, as though he cared not just about my words but about the woman behind them. Yet, as much as I wanted to embrace the feelings growing inside me, the fear of what others might think loomed large. I imagined the whispers, the raised eyebrows, the quiet judgment from people who would undoubtedly see our connection as inappropriate, even scandalous. That fear almost stopped me from seeing him the next time he called, suggesting we go for a walk in the park. My finger hovered over the declined button, but then his voice echoed in my mind. Don't let anyone, not even yourself, tell you otherwise. And so I went. The park was beautiful that day, bathed in the golden hues of autumn. Leaves crunched underfoot as we strolled, our conversation flowing as easily as ever. At one point, we sat on a bench overlooking the lake, the silence between us comfortable, almost intimate. You've been quiet today, Matt said, turning to me. Everything okay? I hesitated, the weight of my feelings threatening to spill over. I've just been thinking, I said finally. About. I turned to him, his face open and expectant. For a moment, I considered telling him everything. The confusion, the fear, the burgeoning feelings I could barely contain. But the words stuck in my throat, and I settled for a half-truth. About how nice it is to have someone like you around. His expression softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing mine briefly. I could say the same about you. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered long after we parted ways. That night, as I lay in bed, I knew there was no denying it anymore. I cared for Matt, deeply, profoundly, and whether or not I was ready to admit it to him, I couldn't keep pretending otherwise to myself. The days that followed were a blur of excitement and confusion, like a storm cloud that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or clear. I felt the stirrings of joy every time I saw Matt or heard his voice. But alongside that joy was a deep, gnawing anxiety that wouldn't let go. I had never imagined myself in this position at my age. I had long ago given up on the idea of passionate love, relegating it to the pages of novels or the fleeting moments of youth. I thought back to my ex-husband, How we had once shared similar moments, small, quiet exchanges that deepened into something meaningful, or so I had thought. But I had learned, perhaps too late, that it wasn't enough to simply feel something. Love required more than just chemistry. It needed trust, respect, a meeting of hearts. Our marriage, when it ended, had been a painful reminder of that fact. Matt was different, though. The connection we shared felt more real than anything I had experienced in years. But that didn't make the situation any less complicated. The doubts crept in at odd times. What would people think if they knew? He was so young, so full of life, while I was me, a woman who had lived through the highs and lows of life, who had endured the challenges of raising children, maintaining a career, and finding herself again after years of feeling invisible. Could I really be enough for someone like him? Would he still see me as attractive, as desirable, if he truly understood the weight of my years? I tried to push these thoughts aside, but they were relentless, and the more I tried to suppress them, the stronger they became. In moments of clarity, I saw the absurdity in my own fears. Why not? Why shouldn't I feel something for him? Yet, in those same moments, another voice whispered from the depths of my mind, reminding me of the judgment that would inevitably follow. Society's constant scrutiny, the whispers about older women and younger men, the labels that had nothing to do with who we truly were as individuals. I had always prided myself on not caring what others thought, but now it felt different. It felt personal. The emotional conflict reached its peak when Matt texted me one evening, asking if I wanted to have dinner with him the following weekend. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. There was something about the simplicity of his invitation that made my chest tighten. He wasn't asking for anything more than a meal, but I knew what it meant. It meant that he saw me, that he wanted to continue this connection, this blossoming friendship that had, without either of us noticing, transformed into something more. I hesitated. The fear of crossing a line, of losing control, of losing myself in a relationship that couldn't be, and should never be, was so strong. But there was also the other part of me, the part that longed to be seen, to feel desired again. That part of me, buried beneath the years of self-doubt and loneliness, whispered, what if this is the moment you've been waiting for? What if this is your chance to feel alive again? I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the anxiety that tightened my throat. And finally I responded, I'd love to. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. The week leading up to our dinner felt like it had been stretched out in slow motion. I couldn't focus on anything. Work, household chores, even conversations with friends seemed distant and insignificant. My mind kept returning to that simple text message, I'd love to. It had felt like a lifeline, pulling me into a world I had long since convinced myself I didn't belong to anymore. On one of those nights, as I stood in front of my closet, trying to choose something to wear, I couldn't help but feel like a teenager preparing for her first date. I pulled on a blouse, then discarded it, unsure of what kind of impression I wanted to make. I found myself self-conscious in a way I hadn't been in years. My reflection in the mirror seemed unfamiliar, an older version of the woman I had been. The years had left their marks, some visible in the fine lines on my face, others in the subtle shift of my body. But then I thought of Matt, how he saw me, not through the lens of my age or my past mistakes, but simply as who I was in the moment. His eyes, always kind and thoughtful, had never seemed to notice the creases on my skin or the weight I'd gained over the years. He simply saw me, and that realization, that small but crucial detail, soothed the butterflies that were wreaking havoc in my stomach. The night of the dinner, I found myself in a quiet state of nervous excitement. When I opened the door to greet Matt, there was no pretense, no heavy expectations, just him, standing there with a bottle of wine in hand and a smile that made my heart skip a beat. He looked casual in a navy shirt and jeans, yet the look in his eyes was anything but casual. There was something there, something in the way he looked at me, a certain warmth that was impossible to ignore. "Hi," he said, his voice low and genuine. "You look beautiful." It wasn't a compliment tossed off carelessly. No, it was a statement that made me feel seen, deeply seen. I didn't have to question his sincerity, because it was written all over his face. He meant it. I invited him in, trying to ignore the rapid pace of my heart. We shared a glass of wine and some light conversation, But it didn't take long before the air between us shifted. There was a quiet intensity, a gentle energy, as if both of us were tiptoeing around the edges of something deeper, something that hadn't yet been fully explored. Over dinner, we talked more freely, our words flowing as naturally as the wine in our glasses. It wasn't just about small talk. Our conversation veered into topics that felt intimate, the kinds of things I hadn't shared in years. We laughed, sometimes awkwardly, other times easily. We spoke of regrets, of dreams, of the moments that shaped us and made us who we were today. It was as though we were drawing out each other's souls, painting the story of our lives in vibrant colors. At one point, he reached across the table to touch my hand and I froze. I hadn't expected it, but I didn't pull away either. His touch was soft, tentative, but filled with a kind of electricity I hadn't felt in so long. For the briefest of moments, I allowed myself to simply feel. The moment hung between us, suspended in the quiet space of possibility. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice gentle. I hesitated. I wasn't sure I could put my feelings into words yet, not without sounding foolish or vulnerable. But then, as I looked into his eyes, I knew he wasn't asking for an explanation. He was just asking me to be real, to be here with him. "I'm thinking that I didn't expect this," I said softly. "I didn't expect to feel this comfortable." He smiled, his thumb brushing lightly over my hand. "I didn't expect it either, but I'm glad it's happening." And in that moment, I knew I had taken the first step into something new. Something I wasn't sure I was ready for, but something I also couldn't deny. The connection we had wasn't just a fleeting spark. It was something deeper, something worth exploring, no matter how scary it might be. We sat together in the soft glow of the evening, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that love, in whatever form it might take, was not something that belonged only to the young. It was a part of all of us, waiting patiently to be found, to be nurtured. And maybe, just maybe, it was finally my turn. The evening deepened, and we found ourselves lingering in the quiet warmth of my living room, the remnants of dinner scattered on the table between us. The air was thick with a sense of something unspoken, yet I couldn't bring myself to break the silence. My mind raced, sorting through the emotions I was trying to hold in check, weighing the risks and rewards of what might come next. I looked at Matt as he casually leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass absent-mindedly, a contented smile playing at the corner of his lips. There was a softness about him that contrasted the energy I felt inside, an energy that felt like it was being slowly wound tighter and tighter with each passing second. "I've never done something like this before," I admitted, breaking the silence. The words hung between us, a confession, raw and vulnerable. Matt's gaze shifted to me, his eyes softer now, more intent. "What do you mean?" "This." I gestured vaguely between us. "This connection. This, whatever this is. I haven't felt this alive in a long time." He didn't say anything right away, as though processing my words carefully. The way he looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to see through the surface and into something deeper, stirred a new kind of vulnerability in me. I wasn't used to being seen so completely, especially by someone so much younger. "I can't help how I feel," he said after a pause. "But I'm not going anywhere if that's what you're wondering." I swallowed, feeling a lump form in my throat. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. The simplicity of his statement, the honesty in his voice, disarmed me in a way I hadn't expected. His words weren't just comforting, they were an invitation. An invitation to trust. But the fear was still there, tugging at my insides. The fear that I was doing something foolish, something reckless. What would people think? Would my friends understand? Would my family understand? But then, as he reached across the table to take my hand again, I realized that none of that mattered. The world outside of this moment, the judgments and expectations, all of it seemed irrelevant. In the stillness of my living room, with the soft light casting shadows around us, there was only us. Only the way he made me feel seen, heard, valued, not for my age, not for the years that separated us, but simply for who I was in that moment. I could feel my heart racing now, the pulse in my fingertips matching the rhythm of my breath. The connection between us had shifted, become something more than words could express. It wasn't about age. It wasn't about what people thought or how it looked on the surface. It was something deeper, something raw and honest that had been unfolding between us in its own quiet way. "I think about you all the time," I whispered before I could stop myself, the words tumbling out before I had the chance to second-guess them. Matt's eyes softened, and I saw something flicker in them, a recognition, a mutual understanding. "You're not the only one," he said, his voice low yet steady. And that was when I felt it, the moment where everything changed, the moment when I no longer had to deny what was happening between us. The spark had long since grown into something brighter, something undeniable. It wasn't just chemistry. It wasn't just a fling or a passing fancy. It was real, raw, and full of potential. Matt stood up then, slowly, as though unsure of what was coming next, yet certain of where he wanted to be. My heart skipped a beat when he reached down, taking my hand and helping me to my feet. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet, steady pull of two people who had found something unexpected in each other. He leaned in, his breath warm against my cheek, and my breath caught in my throat. I closed my eyes, unable to stop myself from drawing in the scent of him, a mix of fresh linen and something uniquely him, comforting and yet electrifying at the same time. When his lips finally met mine, it was gentle, a soft brush at first. It was like the beginning of a symphony, a slow crescendo that made my body hum with anticipation. My hands found their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my fingers. I couldn't help but give in to the kiss, to the warmth, to the sensation of being held in a moment where nothing else mattered. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. No hesitation, no fear, just us. And as the kiss deepened, I realized that this wasn't just about love, it was about connection, about learning to embrace what felt right, despite the doubts and challenges that had plagued me for so long. The age difference, the social expectations, the voices in my head telling me I was too old for this, none of it seemed to matter anymore. What mattered was the here and now. What mattered was Matt, and the way he made me feel alive again. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just a woman marked by time. I was a woman in the midst of something beautiful, something unexpected, and something I wasn't willing to let go of. The days that followed were a whirlwind, each moment spent with Matt adding another layer to the growing bond between us. The world outside my little house seemed distant now, as if it existed in a separate reality, far removed from the quiet, beautiful existence we were building together. The laughter that filled my home, the late-night talks over wine, the shared silences that spoke volumes, each moment was a gift I hadn't realized I was craving. I was no longer that woman who had come to terms with a life lived in quiet routine. I was someone new, someone who had rediscovered a spark that had been buried for years. It was a feeling of renewal, of becoming, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. But with that newness came a familiar tension. As much as I had embraced this relationship, as much as I had allowed myself to love and be loved, I knew the world would soon ask questions. Our age gap was impossible to ignore. Society, with all its rigid expectations, would want to label us, to judge us, and the weight of that was never far from my mind. I found myself lying awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering how the world would see us. Would my friends and family support me, or would they cast judgment, unable to see beyond our years? Would I be seen as foolish, or even worse, as someone who had lost her way? I had spent so many years prioritizing others, thinking about the expectations of the world, the needs of my children, and the demands of being a woman who had long ago settled into a role. But now, in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I realized how much of me I had buried under those layers. And then one afternoon, while we sat together in my living room, I realized that none of that mattered. What mattered was this, what we had built, what we shared. The connection between Matt and me was not defined by what the world thought, but by how we felt when we were together. "I don't care what anyone thinks," I said to him, my voice steady. He looked up, his smile warm and understanding. "Me neither. We're the only ones who have to live our lives, not anyone else." In that moment, it was like a weight lifted off my chest. The doubts that had plagued me, the fear that had kept me at a distance, melted away. I wasn't here to please anyone else. I was here for me. I was here for Matt. And that realization made all the difference. What I had feared most, the judgments, the whispers behind my back, the assumptions about age and love, no longer held power over me. The love we shared was something beautiful, something real. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. I had spent years thinking that love was something that happened in one's youth, a fleeting thing that you could never recapture. But with Matt, I understood that love wasn't confined to a particular age. It wasn't a timeline to follow, but a journey to experience. And with each step, we created something new, something unique. The societal barriers that I had once feared felt insignificant now. Love was love, and it was not bound by age or time. That evening, as we sat close, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, I knew that I had made the right choice. I had followed my heart, even when the path wasn't clear. I had chosen to embrace the love that was unfolding between us, to celebrate it in all its imperfections and beauty. "I'm not afraid anymore," I whispered to him, my voice full of conviction. He leaned in, pressing his forehead to mine, his eyes locked with mine. "Neither am I." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. There were no fears left, no doubts. Just the certainty that love, in all its forms, was worth fighting for. And so, as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, we continued to build our life together. One day at a time, one moment at a time. The world might have had its opinions, but we knew our truth. We knew what we shared was real. It was love in its purest, most unexpected form, and I was ready to embrace it fully, without hesitation. Love, at any age, was worth the risk, and I would never let go of what we had found.